It's 2:45 AM on August the 6th, 1945. A modified B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay catapults herself off a runway in Tinian, a small island above Guam. On board the aircraft is the pilot, Colonel Tibbets, and a crew of 11 other airmen. The most distinctive thing on board, however, is a new kind of weapon. It's called the Little Boy. It's an atomic bomb. The first weapon of its kind that humanity will ever detonate in anger. The crew plot their course to their target, the city of Hiroshima in southern Japan. It's described as a military asset, but 90% of the population is civilian. The residents of Hiroshima don't know it yet, but in exactly 6 hours and 31 minutes from now, a chemical reaction so fast that it's measured in microseconds will begin, and the result will be a nuclear explosion. The immediate blast is devastating beyond belief. One of the survivors, Mrs. Sasaki, pulls herself from the rubble, only to watch a man running toward the smoke. He has an unusual canter, and a distinctive clip-clop rings through the broken street as he presses onwards. He reminds her of a tap dancer with metal soles on his shoes. But as far as she can tell, he isn't wearing any. In fact, as she looks closer, she notices he doesn't have any feet at all. They've been blown off. With each step, his exposed shin bones are crushing against the crystallized sand, echoing out the distinctive brittle tone of a metal shoe. It's just the first stage of a terrifying spectacle that seals the fate of 140,000 people and will end the bloodiest war in human history, as an entire city is reduced to atoms and ashes. The decision to use the bomb was made by President Truman. He's relatively new to the war, with his predecessor Roosevelt having died in office in April 1945. When Truman takes office immediately after Roosevelt's death, he doesn't yet know anything about the bomb, or the 3 years of secret research that it took to make this weapon possible. But he's soon informed that America has a brand new toy to play with, something that can level cities in a single strike. Research for this weapon had started in 1942, after the physicist Albert Einstein wrote a letter of appeal to then President Roosevelt. In the letter, Einstein describes the possibility of a new weapon big enough to destroy an entire port and the surrounding area with one explosion. He urges President Roosevelt to begin research on atomic weapons before the Germans are able to build them for themselves. Roosevelt listens, and so begins the Manhattan Project, in which nearly 600,000 personnel would work in complete secrecy for 3 years. It's headed by US Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves. By July 6, 1945, the bomb was successfully detonated in New Mexico. The weapon had moved from a theoretical idea to a terrifying reality. However, by this stage, Germany had already capitulated, having unconditionally surrendered 2 months before, on May 7th, 1945. America had raced to get this bomb ready before Germany, but now they were suddenly out of the war. US High Command may have finally had their hammer, but no nails. And so, after the first successful detonation of the atom bomb, it's almost immediately suggested that Truman should use this new weapon on the Japanese. But the new US president isn't sure. See, at the time of Germany's surrender, Japan was still in the fight, and Allied forces were determined to end the war with an unconditional surrender from Japan, a surrender which the Japanese were refusing to consider. To break their willpower, America had already been engaging in a campaign of destructive bombing raids on Japan. In March of 1945, America struck Tokyo with a 24-hour blitz of incendiary explosives. Given the fact that most of the city was built with wood, the results were atrocious. 100,000 souls perished in flames hot enough to melt concrete, and gale-force winds caused by the fire were strong enough to rip children out of their parents' grasp, snatched away in an instant and swallowed by a raging inferno. But despite this onslaught from the skies, Japan seemed committed to fight. If the firebombing of Tokyo didn't make a difference, why would an atomic bomb? Truman didn't understand the strategic importance of the nuclear bomb. Not yet, at least. Things started to change once it became increasingly clear that the only way for the Allies to end the war on their terms might be to do things the hard way, invade Japan itself, and remove the government. Given the absolute bloodbath on recent battles for Japanese-held islands in the Pacific, US military command estimated a minimum of around 1 million casualties on the American side alone. The human cost of an invasion would have been unthinkable, and not just for the Americans. Japan was training its civilians to fight in the case of an American invasion. Tactics included strapping mines to children and having them crawl under US tanks. An invasion of the mainland would have demanded unthinkable sacrifice. But the atomic bomb might get Truman the surrender he needed, without the death of millions in a protracted fight. It wasn't just the Japanese Truman was considering. Now that Germany was out the fight, Russia had the freedom to swing east and send soldiers to invade Japan from the north. Truman needed to wrap this fight up with Japan before the Russians got involved. He didn't want to see Japan split in two between the Western Allies and Soviet Russia like Germany had been. If he wanted a surrender from Japan without a sea of American blood and without a possible Soviet occupation, he would need something to end things quickly. The atomic bomb suddenly seemed like the perfect solution. He approved of the use of a nuclear strike on Japan, and on the 26th of July 1945, he issued his last warning: surrender now or face prompt and utter destruction. Tokyo was silent, and with that, the first domino had fallen. A Holocaust would be unleashed in Hiroshima. 5 days after his ultimatum, the Little Boy, the nuclear bomb that would be dropped, was fully assembled in the island of Tinian and ready for use by July 31st. 6 days after that, the Little Boy is loaded onto the Enola Gay, which is airborne by 2:45 AM local time on the 6th of August. William Sterling Parsons, the weaponeer upon the Enola Gay, is concerned about an accidental detonation during takeoff, so he only partially loads the bomb until the plane is flying smoothly. The final stages of assembly won't be completed until the last moments before the bomb is dropped. The flight from Tinian to Hiroshima is uneventful. Japan's air defense capabilities have already been whittled down to nothing. The path to the city lays open. The flight takes around 6 hours and 30 minutes. Just before the Enola Gay makes it to Hiroshima though, there's a problem. At around 8 AM Japanese time, the air raid siren in Hiroshima begins to wail over the city's PA systems. They've been rumbled. The scout plane ahead of the Enola Gay had been spotted flying overhead. Not a good start. Tragically, however, the warning isn't heeded. For the residents below, one lone bomber isn't much of a concern. People continue going about the day. Walking to school, eating breakfast, taking the bus, leaving for work. 250,000 individuals go about their morning as they would any other day. At 8:15 exactly, the Enola Gay is right over Hiroshima. Weaponeer Parsons puts the final pieces of the bomb together. It's set to explode in the air, just above the city. Everything is ready now. Over the intercom, the crew hear "bomb away." It will take 44 seconds for the bomb to fall from the Enola Gay and to its place of detonation. Immediately after dropping the payload, Colonel Tibbets pulls a hard right and turns almost 180 degrees. He has 44 seconds to separate himself from ground zero. As the bomb is slung forward by the momentum of the plane, the aircraft itself turns full heel. The Enola Gay's engine will turn red hot as Tibbets pushes the plane to its limit in order to get as much distance between his crew and the explosion as possible. At the moment of truth, there'll be a measly 10 miles between them. A crewman, Sergeant Bob Caron, will be the only member of the crew who's able to see the bomb as it erupts. At around 8:16 AM, the little boy is approximately 600 meters from the ground. A conventional explosive inside the bomb goes off, compressing the uranium material into a supercritical mass. 1 microsecond later, a neutron slams into the pressed uranium. It's so dense that it's impossible for the neutron to miss the nucleus of a uranium atom. Once an atom is struck, it shatters, releasing more energy and more neutrons. Only another microsecond has passed, but a chain reaction has already begun. Nuclear fission. More and more uranium atoms are smashed to pieces as new neutrons tear through the uranium like shrapnel. Within milliseconds, the entire reaction is complete, and an explosion has occurred. Only 2% of the uranium on board was able to achieve nuclear fission, but the results are astounding. A flash bright enough to pierce through human eyelids bursts across the landscape. Some even report being able to see the bones in their hands as they cover their eyes. Bob Caron is awestruck. He trembles into his radio. It's like a peep into hell. For those below, this is not a peep, but a reality. As a 15 kiloton explosion erupts through the city, some 50,000 people are vaporized instantly. The flash of the explosion simply vanishes them into thin air. The heat, around 7,700 degrees centigrade, is hotter than the surface of the sun. It's enough heat to instantly vaporize absolutely anything within a kilometer of the epicenter. All that remains of someone caught in a blast is a shadow on the ground where they once stood. Within seconds of this initial blast, the mushroom cloud already forms and begins to tower over the demolished city. A shockwave now sallies out from the center, with the strength to knock over every building within 2 kilometers. Those dazed and confused by the blinding flash and the thunderous rupture are suddenly knocked up into the air or crushed alive under falling structures. The blast is so extreme that the crew of the Enola Gay compare the shockwave to anti-aircraft fire, as the plane is rattled around in the sky, still some 10 miles from the epicenter. Tibbets shouts to his crew to hold on to something. They survive the initial blast, and there's nothing left but to look back in horror as they head home. The mission was a success. By 8:18 AM, the mushroom cloud stands at 40,000 feet in the air, and those who survived find themselves in the midst of hell itself. As the mushroom cloud pulls fresh air into the epicenter, an abundance of oxygen is dragged onto the roaring flames, stoking an already punishing fire into a positive inferno. Everything begins to melt, including the people trapped in this nuclear storm. We don't have exact numbers, but between 20 to 40,000 people are roasted alive in the flames and superheated wind. At the same time, those who are further away from the blast center are knocked unconscious. When they open their eyes, they'll see the consequences of this mayhem firsthand. As they come to, they must have felt that they'd woken up in hell. By 8:20 AM, virtually no building is left standing, just a desolate wasteland filled with thousands of voices crying out in pain, screaming for help, screaming for water for their burns, screaming in agony. Melted flesh and skin seep into what's left of the pavement. Many scream for their family members. They'll never find them. And a staggering portion of those left alive are so horrifically burnt by the explosion that they're completely unrecognizable, as their facial features are mutilated and replaced instead with blackened skin and exposed flesh. Those who can run to the river in order to save themselves from burning alive. It won't help them. They'll be boiled alive as the heat begins to sink into the water. There are so many dead in the Aoi River that survivors reported not being able to see any gaps between the bodies. It no longer resembled a stream of water, but an ocean of charred corpses, impossible to tell apart from each other. Thousands more die with each passing minute.
Remember, I remember. A big light comes, very strong light. I never see so strong. I do not know what is happening. My friend, she and I are always together, but I could not find her. So dark it gets, so red like a fire. All is smoking dark red. I cannot see anyone. Many people run. I just follow. Pretty soon like fog, red fog, and gray, and people down all around me. Many people look so awful. Skin come off, just awful. Makes me so scared, so afraid. I never knew such hurt on people. Not human. I think if I'm in hell, it is like this.
By 8:25, just 9 minutes after the explosion, the death count is estimated at around 100,000 and counting. By 8:45, the majority of the shock from the explosion has passed, and those left standing have the task of finding help or helping others, and the local authorities, or what's left of them, start to try and bring order to the chaos. It's an impossible task. The sky has turned completely dark. Irradiated ash and black rain pour down over the city, and the surrounding mountainside erupts into a catastrophic wildfire. Streams upon streams of survivors begin to pour out of the devastated city. Many have skin left red and charred from the intense heat. Some have no skin at all. They march forward hopelessly, in some attempt to find some refuge. The deluge of fire creates another instant problem: crippling dehydration. Nearly every survivor account mentions that within the first minute or two after detonation, a perishing thirst sets in. The superheated environment robs the air of any moisture, and with each breath, the survivors pull this moistureless air into their lungs and airways, leaving them bone dry. Every breath makes you feel as though your throat is on fire. Of the chorus of screaming and crying through the black smoke, the most commonly heard request is mizu, the Japanese word for water. As the wounded drag themselves to makeshift shelters and improvised medical treatment centres, the unthinkable scale of the horror begins to be understood, both in the number of its victims and the extremity of their suffering. But when President Truman hears the operation was a success, he's positively thrilled. This is a step in the right direction. With this new superweapon, he can bring the Japanese to heel. He's so confident in the approach that just a few hours after the explosion, whilst irradiated survivors are still picking the wounded out of the smoking wreck that used to be a city, he makes another declaration: surrender now, or there's more to come. At this point, however, Japan has become as much a victim of internal division as it has of the bombings. Behind closed doors, the Japanese leadership scrambles to give the Americans an answer. Some hardliners, especially those in command of the military, are still determined to fight on. To them, this is just another bomb. While the Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki and Foreign Minister Togo do their best to move the country towards a surrender, the pro-war camp makes sure to stall and delay any decision. 3 days have passed since Truman's demand to surrender, and they receive no official response from Japan. The US president keeps his word. On August 9th, another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, the Fat Man. This time, made from plutonium instead of uranium. It's even more devastating than the hell unleashed in Hiroshima. The initial death count is lower. The bomber crew missed the center of the city. But with these new atomic bombs, accuracy is no longer a crucial factor. Around 65,000 die, and a city is erased, as hell on Earth is unleashed yet again. Truman remains positive about the use of nuclear weapons. He can see Japan beginning to falter under the strain. The end of the war is finally in sight. Truman orders for the construction of a third bomb, but Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, tells Truman he may have to wait a month for it to be processed. Truman is not happy about this. The Soviets officially declared war on Japan on August 9th, the same day of the Nagasaki bombing. In an entire month from now, Stalin could have Russian boots in Japan. Not good. On August 10th, the day after the bombing on Nagasaki, President Truman has a meeting with Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The agenda is to discuss the effect of the Little Boy atomic bomb detonation in Hiroshima. It's the first time President Truman receives a full report and pictures of the carnage, including before and after images of the city. He's horrified. Truman's attitude visibly changes within an instant, and this conversation will lead to a decline in his physical health as he becomes psychologically haunted by the shocking details and the knowledge that he himself is directly responsible. As President Truman listens on with horror, Stimson continues to explain that 100,000 people died within the first hour of the bomb's explosion, and that many, many more will likely die from acute radiation exposure. It's a problem that the Japanese don't fully understand, and neither do the Americans. Not yet, at least. Around this time, US Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, the commander of the Manhattan Project, is called in front of the US Senate to explain the consequences of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When he's asked about radiation poisoning, he describes it as a very pleasant way to die. The victims will quickly go comatose before passing away without suffering. He couldn't be more wrong, but the Senate takes him at his word. America won't fully understand the horror of radiation exposure until nearly a year later, in May 1946, when an atomic scientist, Louis Slotin, accidentally drops a screwdriver while working on a plutonium core, researching a new series of atomic weapons. One slip of the hand, a dropped screwdriver, and a signed death warrant. Louis isn't supposed to be in the lab at all. He's recently tried to resign for moral reasons, having been utterly disgusted after hearing about the devastation in Hiroshima just 9 months ago. He was only allowed to resign on the condition he would train a new scientist to take his place. It was while mentoring his replacement that he found himself handling a plutonium core at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, the same place where the Manhattan Project had begun. Slotin was using the screwdriver to manually keep 2 beryllium half-spheres from closing around a core of plutonium. It's a process known as tickling the dragon's tail, in which you essentially edge a plutonium core close to criticality without allowing it to become supercritical. The idea is that this experiment will allow scientists to better understand exactly how much nuclear material is required for a critical mass, the point at which a nuclear explosion can occur. In this case, it was 6.2 kilograms of plutonium. Researchers call it the demon core. We'll soon see why. As Slotin's hand slips, the 2 beryllium half-spheres clamp shut on the plutonium, causing an instant supercritical event. As soon as the screwdriver leaves his hand, he throws himself between the core and the 7 other people in the building. A bright blue flash and a wave of heat washes over the room. People start screaming. The security guard sprints away, abandoning his post completely. Slotin knocks one of the beryllium half-sphere clamps off, stopping the reaction instantly, but the damage is already done. When Slotin stood between the core and the 7 other researchers, somewhere between 10 to 21 sieverts of radiation was poured into his body within a fraction of a second. We know today that this is 4 times the lethal dose of radiation exposure. He's now a dead man walking. The researchers at Los Alamos don't know this. They do the best they can. An ambulance is called. While waiting, Lewis remains in the lab. The others have already evacuated. He uses his last strength to sketch an incredibly detailed picture of where everybody was standing at the time of the event, so that future scientists can understand how radiation damage works. It's a heroic feat, considering what comes next. By the time the ambulance arrives, Slotin is already vomiting and is convulsing with explosive diarrhea. This is the beginning of 9 days of unimaginable suffering. Once he gets to the hospital, he continues to vomit and excrete watery diarrhea from his bowels. His extremities swell up to over twice their size. The doctors plunge them into ice water. It doesn't help. Blisters form under his skin, then burst, never to heal again. His body is pumped with fresh blood to assist his damaged bloodstream and replace what's lost through the hemorrhaging pustules. His body begins to turn blue from cyanosis. Eventually, the blue patches split open and bleed. His blood is unable to coagulate into scabs. He loses more blood. Then, the same begins to happen in his mouth. Before long, entire sections of his skin begin peeling off. More blood is lost, more blood transfusions are given, 7 in total before he dies. Towards the final days, necrosis sets in, first in his limbs and then in the lining of his blood vessels. By day 7, every stem cell in his bone marrow is gone. He suffers from jaundice, acute thrombosis, extreme epithelial damage in his intestines. His immune system becomes compromised as the radiation mutates his own DNA. He can't make any more white blood cells. He can't make any more red blood cells. He can't make any more cells at all. The bacteria in his own stomach begins to attack his digestive system and surrounding organs as his immune system falls apart. Sepsis begins shortly after, then gangrene. Organs shut down, then tissue death. His bloodstream stops functioning properly, liver failure, followed finally by total organ failure and death. He was suffering on the hospital bed for 9 days. It was a harrowing way to go. The doctors at Los Alamos Hospital are scarred for life. They were not trained for this and never could be. Within hours of his death, Los Alamos doctors begin to perform an autopsy. They're curious about how radiation kills. At this stage, there has never been any rigorous scientific investigation into radiation poisoning. The atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima 9 months ago, but it won't be until 1946 that American scientists see the damage firsthand. As they slice him open, they are immediately confronted with a horrifying sight. The insides of Slotin's body looked unlike anything they had ever seen before. It did not resemble the organs and physiology of a human. What they saw was a mass of rotten flesh and partially decomposed organs. no longer separated by intramuscular tissue or fat. Now simply a pile of biological refuse, like the messy floor of an abattoir. One large, indistinguishable, rotten organ sat in his torso cavity. He had died while decomposing from the inside out. The only saving grace was that Louis Slotin had successfully managed to save the lives of the 7 researchers in the room with him when he threw himself in front of the radioactive burst. But nobody could call this a hero's death. Let's rewind 9 months to 8:50 AM on August 6, 1945. The atomic bomb exploded above Hiroshima 36 minutes ago. People know practically nothing about radiation poisoning at this stage, but the same unthinkably grotesque results are about to be unleashed on the tens of thousands of unsuspecting, injured, isolated, blinded, confused, and terrified survivors of Hiroshima. What's more, while Slotin died from an immediate, high-dosage accident, the citizens of Hiroshima will face deliberate radiation poisoning over the coming days and weeks, as dust particles are sucked into the center of the explosion, toxically irradiated, dragged up into the sky, and then rained down onto the city's survivors. This irradiated material that trickles down onto the victims is called nuclear fallout. It looks something like black snow. Slotin also died from radiation poisoning in a comfortable hospital, surrounded by qualified doctors. The people of Hiroshima, however, won't have access to the medical care or the painkillers that are available in a hospital, because no functioning hospital remains standing in Hiroshima. The Red Cross hospital remained partially operational, but most of the staff died in the immediate blast, and most of the hospital building was lost in the firestorm. Those remaining medical staff are themselves injured and have lost most of their medical supplies to the explosion. And now they are under an avalanche of survivors, covered in third-degree burns, vomiting from radiation sickness, carrying limbs that were blown off in the initial blast. One man is guided to the hospital by another survivor. When he gets there, he reports to the skeleton medical team. In his hands, he is holding his own eyeballs. On a typical day, the Red Cross Hospital Hiroshima would treat between 200 to 300 patients. By 5 PM on the day of the blast, they'll be completely overwhelmed with a staggering 12,000 patients, more severely injured than anything they'd ever seen, and with less than half their usual staff, no clean water, and no equipment. Dr. Tatsuichio Akizuki, a doctor at the hospital, wrote in his memoir that the hospital turned into a hell, with many survivors wandering in a daze, skin hanging off their bodies, eyes swollen shut, and faces melted. Another doctor, named Sasaki, a surgeon, is forced to perform improvised amputations without anaesthetic, make heartbreaking decisions about who to help and who to leave for dead. There are a lot of dead. Patients can't get to doctors because the hallways are piled with hundreds of corpses. People have died while waiting for help. A flood of vomit, excrement, blood, and melted flesh begins to make what little remains of the hospital unusable. The medical staff hunt to find anyone who is strong enough to help, to start dragging the dead outside into a pile, soon higher than the people still standing, left outside in a mass open grave. Now that the hospital floor is clean again, Sasaki and Akizuki can continue treating patients. As time goes on, things go from bad to worse. Sasaki, the surgeon, works for 3 straight days before collapsing from injury and exhaustion. Unlike the American scientists who witnessed Slotin's death, the Japanese doctors in the Red Cross have never seen radiation sickness before. They're confused as to why patients who seem to be recovering are suddenly getting sick, vomiting, bleeding from every orifice. Nobody knows what's happening to them or why. Over the coming days and weeks, parents will bring their children sick from radiation to the hospital. The doctors recognize the symptoms, but have no way to treat them. Parents wail at the feet of doctors as they're flatly told there's nothing to be done. Other survivors know even less than the doctors do. Akiko Takura is 20 years old at the time of the blast. She recalls the damages of radiation. After seeing people's skin hung off their body like rags, many are also badly burnt from the fire, and after hours of trying to survive, they're thirsty. As the black irradiated rain pours down from the sky, many survivors beneath make an effort to lay underneath the downpour, with their mouths open to catch the rain. They had no idea they were sealing the deal for some of the most terrifying deaths possible. Sadako Sasaki, one of the most well-known victims, survived the initial blast, but developed leukemia due to radiation exposure. She became famous for folding 1,000 paper cranes in a hope to recover, but died from radiation-induced illness in 1955 at the age of 12. You could say she survived for 10 years after the explosion. The reality is that it took her 10 years to die. Takako Ishida was 2.4 kilometers from the epicenter and was only 11 years old. When she finally had the strength to stand, she looked at herself in the mirror. She describes what she saw in the reflection as a red ogre. She was a victim of radiation burns. Later her face would turn black. She remained this way for years. She says, "When I remember two classmates, both of whom died at the age of 11, I cannot help but cry bitterly. It doesn't make sense that we were exposed to radiation at the same place, yet some died within a couple of days, while others like me still live even after some 60 years have passed." That's the terrifying thing about radiation poisoning. It's a roll of the dice. You never know if you've received a fatal dose or not. By December of 1945, another 40,000 people will die of radiation poisoning. Tallying the death count further than that is almost impossible, but the victims will continue to pile up over the decades, even if they're not fully recorded. The official death toll is 140,000 lives. Those lucky enough to survive the bombings will be shunned for the remainder of their lives as a stigma builds up around those exposed to radiation. People are terrified that it can be transmitted like any other disease, or that it will produce children riddled with birth defects. The consequences of the bombing resonate down the ages. In the wake of these new reports of radiation sickness, Truman continues to feel disgusted at his own use of the bomb. On August the 11th, he begins to backtrack, announcing that, "You have to understand, this isn't a military weapon. It's used to wipe out women and children and unarmed people, and not for military uses." The government of Japan also begins to change course. Surrender seems like the only option, but the clock is ticking. On the 10th of August, Brigadier Groves writes to Truman with good news. That bomb that was supposed to take a month to build is almost completed. It will be ready in just a week. Truman panics and sends out a mass order. Nobody is to drop another nuclear bomb without his explicit order to do so. It's the beginning of presidential controls over nuclear weapons, and without it, the American army would have the final say over when and where to use them. Meanwhile, the Japanese army in Manchuria is being rolled back by a Russian onslaught. Stalin has joined the war, with crushing results. By August 15th, Truman gets what he wants. Japan surrenders. Their only condition is that the Emperor Hirohito remain in power. The US slap the request down, and Japan agrees to surrender unconditionally, although the US does eventually decide to keep Hirohito on the throne. With that, a war that began with soldiers on horseback ends with a weapon that can instantly annihilate people by the hundreds of thousands. Back at home, Americans are enthralled, and public opinion on the bombings is callous. 85% of Americans approve of the bombings in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a separate survey, 25% say they're disappointed that the war ended before America had the chance to drop more bombs. It's a painful example of the utter contempt that Americans had towards Japan by this stage of the war. Although the human cost to Japan is unthinkable, they come out of the war in a relatively decent shape. Although globally humiliated, they'll be firmly under the yoke of a new American world order, and the US will use her vast economic might to begin rebuilding Japan. The quality of life for the average Japanese citizen soars over the next decades. On the global stage, the biggest loser is Russia. Although they've annexed the Central and Eastern European states after their struggle against Germany, they've been unable to establish a major foothold in Asia. What's worse, the discovery of this new American superweapon has thrown the delicate balance of power into the air. Territory doesn't count for much when it can be vaporized in an instant. In order to secure his position as an equal to the US, Stalin gives the order for his scientists to build the bomb as quickly as possible. And in the same moment that World War II, the bloodiest conflict in human history, ends, a new conflict begins. It's called the Cold War. It will last far longer than World War II. Some argue it hasn't ended. During World War II, America was only ever able to field 2 nuclear bombs at any time. Both were atomic bombs, delivering a payload of around 15 kilotons. As of 2015, 70 years after Hiroshima, the US and Russia have a combined number of around 8,500 of these weapons, oftentimes with kilotons in the hundreds. These new hydrogen bombs are powerful enough to make the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like veritable firecrackers. They can deliver a yield up to 80 times more powerful than the little boy atomic bomb. What's more terrifying is that if you live near a military base, industrial asset, or dense population centre, one of these missiles is pointed at you right now. Should it be launched, it would take less than 30 minutes to reach you. If you receive any warning at all, it'll be around 5 minutes before impact. 5 minutes to prepare for a nuclear strike that would dwarf the bombs of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. In 1945, the world was thrown under the shadow of a mushroom cloud, a shadow which still hangs over us today. The possibility of a total nuclear holocaust and the end of civilization. If you'd like to know more about nuclear weapons, we'll have another video coming soon on what would happen if a bomb was launched today, based on this incredible book, Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobsen, which was also invaluable in our research for this video. If you'd like to see that, give us a subscribe so you don't miss it. I've been Jake, cheers for watching.